it looks like that Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, is pushing for a regime change in Tehran. And however, US is carefully assessing the situation. What do we know at this moment? And what if, hypothetically, that we're looking for a regime change in Iran? What does that signify for the nation of US and also for the Israel? And critically speaking, what about for the bigger picture? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor, is a former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, former chair of the Department of Cultural Eurasian Studies, and he's currently the director of Eurasian and Uralic National Resources Center at Indiana University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will.
Well, Professor Choksy, not too long ago, you and I, we had the conversation regarding the political and also this economic situation in Iran. But right now, since last Friday, the war between US and Iran drew the attention worldwide. At this moment, let's get to the most fundamental question, Professor Choksy. From your perspective, what do you think President Trump should do at this moment? So in other words, everyone is very concerned whether US should continue to support Israel in this war, or at this moment, Trump administration should be strategically careful about the situation. What do you think of that? Let's start from right there.
Yes, indeed, that is a good starting point. And it is one where, in the words of President Trump, no one knows what he's going to do, perhaps not even him. In other words, he has accelerated. Initially, he talked about wanting de-escalation between Israel and Iran. He had attempted to prevent Israel from attacking because he was negotiating with Iran. That did not work. The latest we are at is he has called for an unconditional surrender from Iran. He has made it clear that the United States knows where Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the other elites are hiding. He has said that they can be killed, but for now, he's not going to do so. So the next step is, as you pointed out, the crucial one. In other words, does he proceed to join Israel in taking out the Iranian leadership? Does he keep the Iranian leadership in place? But he, at the same time, also goes after the nuclear sites. So there are a couple of questions here. One is, what happens to the Iranian leadership? In other words, does he pursue regime change? The other is, instead of regime change, does President Trump do the one thing that Israel cannot so far, and that is use the very large ordnance bunker-busting bombs that the United States has to demolish Iran's nuclear facilities? The honest truth is, we don't know. Everything seems to indicate that the United States will attack. However, let's also keep something in mind, that in diplomacy and even in war, there is also a lot of bluffing. And so, at this point, the United States could appear to be gearing up. And yet, that could be also a way of ensuring that Iran backs down. The one red line for President Trump is Iran should never have nuclear weapons. So that's where we stand right now. It is quite possible that the United States will move to end the situation with Iran.
Professor Choksy, again, according to Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel at this moment, he's been calling for what we called a regime change. Now, we know that today, when we talk about, when we rephrase the concept of regime change, it's not a piece of cake. So in other words, it's not as easy that finish writing a chapter of the book and then I move on to the next chapter. Because today, when we talk about regime change, it's rather complicated. So my next question to you, Professor Choksy, is what does that mean when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called for regime change, and how complicated or how intricate the system is in order to achieve that goal? Because again, going back to what I said before, this is 2025. Regime change involve or demands so much more complexity than we ever imagined. How do you think that we're able to achieve that goal if possible? Or if not, what are the alternatives for Benjamin Netanyahu at this moment?
So, the Prime Minister of Israel certainly is focused, shall we say, not just on reducing Iran's nuclear program, as you have mentioned, but also, as you have mentioned, on, if possible, changing the regime in Iran. The underlying premise being that if Iran had a non-Islamist regime, that it would be less threatening to Israel, less threatening to the West, perhaps a better player on the global stage. The complexity there, of course, is how does one remove the Islamist rulers of Iran while at the same time ensuring a smooth transition to a secular government? Now, is it possible? Yes. Is it complicated? Yes. What are the chances of success? Frankly, unknown. Can the supreme leader and the clerics who ultimately control Iran be eliminated? Well, Israel has demonstrated that that is a relatively easy task. The question then is, who is or should be left to run the country? Something that we may want to keep in mind is that the Iranian constitution has an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch. In other words, it has a presidency with a cabinet and all such things. It has an elected parliament. It has a judiciary. But it also has above it the theocracy. Just as previously, before 1979, it had a monarchy above it. And the complexity of Iran is that you have what appears to be essentially a democratic system of elected officials, but you have this oversight and ultimate reporting authority to a chief cleric, almost if you wish to, if you compare it to the Vatican, where the Pope ultimately is the head. So the question is, if Israel or the United States were to move towards regime change, can the theocracy be removed, the theocratic branch of government be removed, while still preserving the chief executive? So the chief executive right now, Pezeshkian, he is an elected president. He's actually a reformist. He's not a clergyman. So the temptation for Israel, perhaps even for President Trump, would be, can he remove the supreme leader and the other leading clerics while maintaining the more secular leadership? But then the next question is, once that is done, how rapidly can not just the United States, but the world, and I would include Russia and China in this, move to then stabilize the secular leadership, remove sanctions, and help rebuild Iranian society? So regime change is not just removal of current leaders or some of the leaders, but then how do you stabilize the society thereafter? That is the big challenge. That's the challenge we saw and the failure we saw in Iraq and in Afghanistan recently.
Well, Professor Choksy, let's move to another piece of reality. Recently, the supreme leader of Iranian government made the proclamation to the public and regarding the attention from the US and also from Israel. Now, during the summit, now the ethos of, air quote, death to Israel and death to America does reflect the national interest of Iran. I mean, the media show that. The world was watching that. And again, from the American perspective, it's rather frightening and threatening to see that the Iranian regime is chanting along with the citizens towards death to Israel and death to America. We know that within the political science field, Professor Choksy, you know this, there are two words. One thing we called noises. The other one we called signals. Well, again, from my immature perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, such slogan or such chant is no longer just a noise. It's actually a signal to Israel and to the US. So, Professor, from your perspective, from your view, that how concerning are those chantings? So how concerning are those proclamations to Israel and to US? Because another piece of reality, Professor, is from military perspective, from technological perspective, and diplomatically perspective, Iran is outmatched in every sense by Israel. How do we assess that? And how do we even accept that reality at this moment?
And that is a good question. It's a good question because that slogan has been used since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And perhaps that slogan is the root cause, ultimately, of all these problems. In other words, it could be speculated that even a nuclear Iran would not be worrisome to Israel or to the United States or to anyone else if the regime's leadership and the regime's followers would not on a regular basis make such proclamations. Now, how reflective are the proclamations of the nation of Iran? They are reflective of the leadership, the clerical leadership, of the Islamic Republic Guard, of the military, and of the die-hard followers of the regime. Repeated polls have shown that the majority of Iranian citizens do not believe that they want interaction with the United States. They even want relations with Israel. They want good relations with the rest of the world. They want to be part of the global community. They want to interact, travel, trade, all the rest. But the danger is that as Iran has developed its missile programs, its drone programs, we have seen its increasing capability. Right now, there is a war going on between Israel and Iran. And while Iran is getting pummeled, it is also striking back. We've seen missiles hit Tel Aviv and the other cities of Israel. So there is that reality. At the same time, as you mentioned, it is not a symmetrical war. Iran will ultimately run out of drones and missiles. It has never had an air force of any value, and so indeed Israel rules the skies over Iran right now. That's clear. Iran does not have any borders or direct access to Israel, particularly now with the fall of Syria, that used to be Iran's ally. There's no way Iran can have its armies reach Israel. So Iran's capability is largely limited to missiles and drones. And increasingly, what we are seeing as we look at the pattern of attacks is that the number of missiles and drones is falling off. There will come a point which Iran will no longer be able to attack because it won't have missiles and drones left. It certainly has no one to supply it. At this point, it's going to be very difficult, let's say, for Russia or North Korea to resupply Iran. Russia has its own war going on with Ukraine, but Israel can be resupplied by the United States and Europe. So yes, if one is gaming out the war over the next couple of weeks, Iran is on the losing side. The question then, with that loss, is what does that mean for Iran? Can the Islamist regime in Iran then survive that loss, or will it also topple? And when it topples, that's the question of when the United States, Russia, China, and the world has to be ready to move. Whether it topples internally, because let us be, we've seen the images of people fleeing Tehran, and that, so those realities are going to strike the Iranian leadership very quickly, and then at that point, the chant is becoming noise rather than any sort of reality.
Professor Choksy, I remember last time you and we had a conversation, and I happened to borrow a quote from the famous British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and I think it still applies to what's happening today. I want to rephrase it one more time. Churchill once said, "American always knows how to make the best decision after exhausting all the possibilities." Now, we know that Trump still appears very much interested in negotiating a new nuclear deal that will fulfill his pledge that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. Now, within this conservative or Republican party, there seemed to be a division between, among the members when we talk about the situation in Iran. Some believe that U.S. ought to stay out of the war. Mainly, it's not the U.S. responsibility to put on the plate. But others believe, or those hawkish warrior belief, that U.S. must take initiative to support Israel. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, again, I'm not asking you to take side, but let's just assess the reality. Trump pledged that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. In reality, or in actuality, how feasible is that? And how do you think that we understand under what circumstances that Iran will give up, or to be hypothetically be willing to give up this nuclear weapon development in order to, I want to be careful, to strengthen or even to regain the relationship with the U.S. and also rest of the world? What do you say to that?
Yes. So President Trump has always taken the position that the United States should not get involved in foreign wars. That is one of the tenets of the base of his support. There indeed are other members of the Republican Party who do, however, believe that Iran should be neutralized in a military sense. Hitherto, President Trump has pursued the diplomatic path. I do believe that if the opportunity still exists for a diplomatic solution, Trump will take it. He knows that that is what his political base, the MAGA group, want. He knows that getting involved in a foreign war is always unpredictable. It's not that Iran can strike the United States. Yes, it may be able to launch a few missiles against some American bases in the Middle East, but that's really inconsequential. There may be some deaths and damages, but it's not going to fundamentally change or threaten the United States. On the other hand, being able, even at this point, to mediate a ceasefire, like happened between Pakistan and India recently, or being able to mediate a ceasefire between, not just a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, but then also being able to revive negotiations so that there is denuclearization of Iran. That, I believe, is the preferred path for President Trump. It certainly would be the preferred path, I believe, for the majority of the U.S. public. However, preferred paths are often not how the world works. And as we saw while negotiations were going on, Israel moved to attack Iran's nuclear and military facilities because Israel, however, did not trust the outcome of the negotiations, that the negotiations would indeed defang Iran. So the question now, of course, is not just Israel's position and Iran's position, is also what can the United States convince Iran, or shall we even say, can the bombs that are raining down on Iran convince the Iran's supreme leader, who ultimately makes the final decision, to say, yes, let's reach a ceasefire, let's go back to the negotiating table and very quickly reach an agreement under which Iran gives up nuclear weapons. Now, again, the big problem here has been that Iran has always taken the position that it doesn't want nuclear weapons. In fairness to Iran, Iran has stayed within the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has permitted inspections. But Iran, on the other hand, has always insisted that it does have and should retain the right for nuclear fuel enrichment. That is the sticking point. Israel believes that if Iran continues to enrich, it will eventually produce a bomb. The United States is insisting that Iran not enrich within the country, that it maintains civilian nuclear facilities, but the uranium be provided from outside, in order to be able to control the level of enrichment. Those were the sticking points at which Israel attacked. So the question is, can we go back to the negotiating table with even a temporary ceasefire and move beyond that deadlock? In other words, is the supreme leader willing to say, okay, we will continue to have for Iran peaceful nuclear energy, but we will give up our demand for enrichment? The Iranians have not been willing to do so.
Professor Choksy, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, as we know that Iran today is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. I mean, again, this is not something new to us. But again, by assessing the situation in Iran and Israel, some experts believe or even suggest that diplomacy is the most effective way to prevent Iran from nuclearization, short of an incredibly costly war that would be unlikely to permanently dismantle the Iranian nuclear programs. Now, Professor Choksy, you and I, we had a similar conversation beyond or even prior to the war. At this moment, from your perspective, how do we understand the word diplomacy at this moment? And also, should we believe that diplomacy is the most effective way towards denuclearization at this moment? And I think this is something not only the Trump administration, but the whole world could celebrate if we can put our hands together to make this happen. What do you say to that?
And that is, of course, a very interesting question, because in the past few months, we have seen Israel's capability to decimate Iran's proxies. Syria, that used to be Iran's ally, the Assad regime, is gone. Hezbollah in Lebanon has been weakened. Hamas has been weakened. Even the Houthis have reached an agreement with the Trump administration, and the Houthis no longer attack international shipping and U.S. shipping, even Chinese shipping in the Gulf of Aden. So Iran has seen its capability of at least regional terrorism being greatly reduced. And much of that reduction has been through Israel's attacks on Iran's terrorist allies. Now, emboldened by that success, Israel seems to be claiming and demonstrating that perhaps the way to take care of Iran's nuclear problem is to destroy its capabilities. In other words, it would appear that at least Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership has run out of patience with the diplomatic track. The question, therefore, is, can we get back on that track? And if that track does not emerge quickly, will the United States also be tempted to follow the Israeli pattern and say, okay, maybe we cannot prevent Iran from rebuilding its nuclear facilities, but if we destroy the current facilities, well, it may take Iran 10 years to rebuild. That's 10 years of not worrying about a nuclear Iran. And when Iran rebuilds, well, just bomb them again. And so the problem here is that that pattern may emerge unless the diplomatic path recommences. And in that sense, the ball of diplomacy is much more in Iran's court, even though it is under attack, because it has to say, look, we are willing to pause our nuclear development. Well, let's keep in mind that the Israeli attacks on Iran's nuclear and military facilities occurred right after the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, issued a report indicating that Iran was continuing to cheat.
Professor Choksy, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, when we talk about Iran, I want to bring the Houthis are in our conversation. Some say that without Iran, or without the support of Iran, the Houthis are just another mountain tribe with a dream. Look at what's happening in Iran. Look at what the Houthis has done into the community and even to the world. Equally terrifying at this moment. So, Professor, from your perspective, again, we don't know the outcome of the war. We don't know the decision under Trump administration at this moment. But let's just put ourselves in the perspective of the Houthis. Without Iran, is it just another mountain tribe with a dream for Houthis? Or is time for the Houthis to wake up and to realize there gotta be something else that we need to do in order to change the situation? Your final thoughts.
My thoughts there is that the Houthis, yes, they may have begun as a mountain tribe. However, they now control a substantial part of Yemen. They have shown that they have, at the very least, military capability in the region. It's not like the Houthis ultimately can threaten the state of Israel or any other nation nearby. They can create trouble. They can cause disruptions in Saudi Arabia, etc. But they can't bring down the Saudi government. They can't bring down the Emirates or Israel or any other region. What the Houthis can take from all this is that their alliance with Iran permitted them to become a national entity. Irrespective of what happens with Iran, the Houthis are here to stay. And perhaps what the Houthis should be doing is focusing on building their portion of Yemen into a stable nation, so that the Houthis are able to run Yemen with or without Iranian support. In other words, if you see the Houthis as a child of Iran, or maybe it's time for the Houthis to grow up and take control of their house and not rely on Iran, but also to understand that maybe they should not be so closely allied with Iran. Because so doing, particularly if the regime in Iran is ousted, it would be in the Houthis' interest to place some degree of separation and go their own way.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, at this moment, the whole world continues to pay attention to the ongoing war between Israel and Iran. Whether Benjamin Netanyahu is looking for a regime change, or Donald Trump is looking for the denuclearization of Iran? We don't know. But one thing we do know, it's any international conflict, it's going to make the world more complicated and also demands the attention of the energy, demands the attention of the collaboration. And surely this is not something that we're enjoying seeing at this moment. But we need to pay attention to the Iranian regime at this moment, and also the strong message from the Israeli government. Well, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Professor Choksy. Again, Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor, and he's currently the director of the Inter-Asia and Uralic National Resources Center at Indiana University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure of speaking to you. We love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the war in Israel and Iran. And hopefully next time when we have the conversation, we're able to hear from the Trump administration regarding the next move. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Great pleasure.